second presenter, we will have another good friend with also strong connection to Tartu, because he's working there in our dear Department of Semiotics in Tartu, Tiit Remm. And he is a researcher there in Tartu Department of Semiotics. He's focused on sociosemiotics and semiotics of space, particularly on urban semiotics and the use of spatial environment and spatial concepts for societal management. And he's also interested in some semiotic aspects of spatial modeling in humanities and social sciences in general. And today he will talk to us about, well, title of his talk is Chronotopic Analysis for the Semiotics of Space. And yeah, Tiit, floor is yours.
Thank you and hello. And let me share some pictures. So can you see my slides and me and hear me?
Yes, everything seems good.
Good, perfect. Then luckily I am not so lonely. I have some friends here also, Andrew and Polly. And also the topic I'm going to talk about. For this I've had some work together with some students as well as some colleagues for some time ago, and it's, well, something that can be discussed and also related to the everyday spaces. So the title which I proposed was Chronotopical Analysis for the Semiotics of Space, which is something I've been working on in like a low intensity for some time, but now added the material of recent urban squares in small Estonian towns, which was a kind of campaign from the Society of Architects dedicated for the 100th anniversary of the Republic of Estonia. So a kind of special occasion for which 30 urban squares or central areas of small towns were redesigned, which is like a nice visual material. But the more theoretical methodological question is actually related to the applicability of chronotope. As you might know, the concept of chronotope is closely related to, well, the discussions of space and time in the beginning of 20th century and before, and the question of relativity. And well, at least let's say this line started from biologist Tomsky, from whom Bakhtin took the idea of chronotope. Initially, the idea that all organisms have their own space and time where they live. But for Bakhtin, it was then the tool for literary analysis and the typological study of literature, as well as study of texts in different levels. And the line which I have tried to apply is that Peter Torop has then developed these Bakhtinian ideas further and applied the chronotopical analysis and proposed it as chronotopical analysis of the film studies, but even further to cultural analysis as a kind of transdisciplinary field. So going from very specific study or immanent study of text to the overall study of not only cultural practices, but cultural theory as well. And then my question is, if it's the study of space and time, can you actually apply it in a way back to our everyday spaces and to the kind of spatial environment, or it has to stay on in this abstract level? And while it's space and time, then actually, while the chronotopic analysis distinguishes different levels and different chronotopes, then in a way the chronotope remains kind of abstract, well, in a way synonymic to world or life world, different worlds. You can say there is spatial temporal structure, but you can also talk a bit more generally, so not so strictly about space and time. And the concept has, of course, been used a bit also in semiotics of space before. For example, Joseph Montanola has applied in relation to the architectural production, and also in kind of ecosemiotic ways. There are works about, in a way, following the utopian line that in the landscape chronotopes, that are, depending on the organisms, different chronotopes, and chronotopical analysis of representations of space, landscapes, or the chronotopes of, for example, pubs in Dublin and so on. So it is here and there applied. And once I did also with Kadri Kasemets a study of a kind of travel story to Hashima Island, which was like a first test of this. But now, as this one was applied more for the travel story, so again, a kind of description where you can distinguish different levels. Then further interest has been whether it's applicable to the analysis of, namely, real life everyday environments also. So in this sense, the semiotics of space in a more narrower sense. And the examples of what you saw before, the squares, can you do something with this analysis on the squares all around Estonia? To come to the basics, here is a table from Peter Torop from 1984 about the sphere of semiotization in the same issue of Science System Studies, where Lotman proposed the term semiosphere. And it's like the original publication of the scheme, which you can see in different articles from Peter, distinguishing 3 levels of chronotopes: topographical, psychological, and metaphysical. And then aspects of this world here: anthropocentrism and theocentrism. For example, a more recent example of the table. And the core idea is then that the chronotope, that there can be distinguished 3 levels of chronotopes: the topographical, which relates to the kind of story world, space and time. You can name the objects there, the spatial environment. In a text, it's like the description of where something happens. The psychological, related to the experience, the characters, how they live through, and so on. In this sense of subjective, well, the first one is more or less unified. There is one world, and the psychological is subjective. Therefore, there are many of them, many points of view. And the third one should be metaphysical, where there is also multiplicity in it, but multiplicity related to one point of view. in a way, the point of view of the author or the main meaning of the text, kind of something that makes the text to be a whole, the conceptual world. And in a way, quite a simple and applicable scheme. But there are also problems when applying. For example, starting with the space of interior design. The example of a manor house next to Tartu. Well, the manor house doesn't exist anymore, but it's related to the National Museum. Anyway, if we have this kind of historical room, then how can we read it? And then chronotopical analysis could give the framework where you can distinguish 3 layers. For example, in those kind of interiors, characteristically, there was a lot of furniture, especially a lot of chairs. Even so many that so it was the house of noblemen. They had lots of visitors, parties, and so on, but probably never there was so many people that they could sit all the chairs. So there might be different social situation for each drinking of tea. There is different table and chairs where to sit, and most of all they were heritage, family heritage. You just had them and you had to put them somewhere in your big house. But then how to read them? For applying to the semiotics of space, you can say that the topographical layer is related to objects that can be found in space. But the difficulty when applying the framework is that in artistic text, which was initially the object of Bakhtin, we have namely the whole of the text, so we know what is the whole. It's limited. There is more or less defined meaning also, and define the language of it, define semantic space, so you can distinguish objects. What is there in the actual everyday environment? What are the real objects that we should distinguish there? What is the possible reading of them? It's quite open, as you don't have this fixed delimitation of the reality. As a researcher, you can start wherever and end wherever. There are some rules. For example, an interior of a room can be one rule, but you can also see it in connection to other rooms or to the hallway or to the house or to the tradition. And also in urban space, it's not that clearly limited, whether it's a physical setting or it is also a work of art from an architect. So it's a fuzzy. But in everyday spaces, you can say that, well, getting back to the basics of semiotics of space, as besides distinguishing the 3 layers, we can distinguish 2 basic categories by which spatial environment is meaningful, namely by use and by status, for example, like signifying so that it's related to actual uses, or signifying the uses or the distinctions, and so on. So it's either the signifying the use itself, or the focus is on it as a sign. And thereby we can say that the topographical layer has 2 sides. Well, in total, it's a spatial language in a way, or space as language. And one part is affordances, what it enables, but it enables whatever in principle, in theory. and the other part is objects, and then objects are already kind of categorized entities, which already shows that while in literary text you can say there are clear objects, there is a church, there is a bench, then in the everyday environment we maybe recognize more easier that they are not pre-given objectively, but they are given as objects in our cultural reading of the environment. So it's already culturally coded way of organizing and recognizing the objects there. That there is the meaning of spatial objects is depending on the possible use that is recognized in them. So it's part of the affordances that are there and the cultural coding of functions. So that the chair enables sitting as well as different kinds of sitting, and it might afford it physically and be in relation to organism, its abilities to sit, but it's also coded and designed so that it's recognizable as something to sit on, and that's in the sense that we have an environment of objects in interior design as well as outside in urban space. Yes, and the second layer, there is the psychological chronotope, meaning the world of people, which on the use side is actual interactions or actions, the uses of space, which is in a way interpretation of the space and what it affords. And on the other side, as uses are related to social activity, or if we talk about the interactions, then not just the process of interaction, but the interaction is organized by various kinds of distinctions. And here comes the signification mode in. We can say that also those chairs in a house, they are not only interpreted in actual uses of people, but they also signify, and people can, even though understanding that, for example, ladies sit and gentlemen stand, they can be interpreted in use differently, and those rules, social rules, can be broken. Yeah, or that what kind of setting of chairs and tables provides a situation for tea drinking, what is for some discussion with cognac or cigar. So it defines the social situation, which is read by actual users. And the same goes for urban space and this kind of squares, where you can find spatial language of all kinds of objects, and you can recognize them, though sometimes they are quite hard to interpret as due to their playful or modern design. And then there are users who use it for interactions, for actions, for playing children or walking and so on. And then you can see how the users are using the public space to carry out some social distinctions or denying distinctions, or at least categorization, starting even from the functionality of either the spaces for cars or for pedestrians. And this provides this socially meaningful space on the two sides of it, but it actually goes even more interesting when we ask for the metaphysical layer, as it's quite everyday thing to recognize objects, what they afford, how they are used, and what are the distinctions users might make. But is there also a metaphysical layer, and what would it be if in a literary text it's the position of the perspective of the author and the conceptual whole from the author, then what is it for an urban square, for example? And theoretically, it should be related to some kind of ideological models of the space. And just as hints, in case of those squares, it might be read from this kind of discourse about them or how they are proposed as well as projected, like the idea of multifunctionality or user friendliness, or the contemporariness, the human scale, the value of public space, and so on. Where are those models to be found, and whose perspective it actually should be? Well, the problem with this everyday space is that while we have for artistic text, we have one whole. You can read a book, it's more or less defined as a whole. An everyday situation, you can say that it is also just one defined whole, and it's defined from the perspective of the particular person who is there. The person uses the square, reads the objects, and sees the ideological meaning. That's what defines it. Every reader then defining the whole. And this is actually the value of chronotopic analysis, that it's not just layers that are out there, but it actually provides the framework to integrate different perspectives, that we have the aspects that you can describe, but also the beginning point of the analysis can be any of those. You can start from the physical space, from the subjective interpretation, from ideological models, and depending on where you start from, the other ones will emerge and organize respectively, so that actually what objects are there out there on the urban square depends on whether you start from the physical space or the materials, or the ideological models that you want to see or the subjective uses. And users actually don't notice most of the elements that are there on the square. So in their reality, they just don't exist, and it's no reason to say that they are there if you start from the subjective point of view. So it gives the variety of perspectives and possibility to integrate them and see the same place from different perspectives in an integrated mode. But there are also, while it's hard to define the ideological models, there are some starting points. For example, I can say in the same way as literary work has an author, or is said to have. Not everyone agrees with it. That there is also an architect who draws the project for a square, and is the author of this architectural work as an artistic piece. And from that perspective, it is a conceptual whole, and so on. But on the other hand, as Raymond Ledoux has said, the city is a kind of pseudo-text, a pseudo-speech from a pseudo-utterer, because there is, yes, an architect, but there is also the someone who orders the work, who builds it, the actual builders, the ones who read it, to redesign it, and so on. So it's actually a collective whole. Besides, as we noticed from the empirical study of those squares, they might have very fancy designs and intended meanings. For example, in this picture, you can see a place in Elva, a small town near to Tartu. The square is called Tõstrapõõsaste vahel, or in the middle of very bushes. And it's very common that this kind of square has a metaphorical idea behind it, and it's presented through it. But when it's opened next day, nobody remembers it anymore. No users knows it, and it's hardly recognizable. This idea, it doesn't actually give this code of reading to anyone, unless you are keen to those architectural ideas. In this sense, you could look for some more general cultural or ideological models out there, but they might be very varied and general, for which a solution is then that there is also a kind of mythologization, which might give a kind of more unified perspective, at least as an option for seeing this heteroglossia or heterophony, that there is multitude of interpretations, but they are somehow unified. And in terms of, so you can apply the concept of myth or myth today from Roland Barthes quite well here, maybe also because of the nature of those examples, as they are kind of political, ideological works made during a campaign and so on. And to apply it, you can see that there is a kind of spatial language and the speech of squares, meaning that there is throughout those 30 squares, there is kind of common elements, common language of visual and spatial design used, and each square has its kind of own speech also. And typically for a myth, there is a kind of tense and form dynamics and this switch of the role of this speech, so that the basis is formed by the functional signification of the semiotics of space. All the elements are functional, the pavement, the chairs, and so on. And then it's used to signify something else. It's also closely related to its original historical context. It might forget it, but it's still from those recent years related to the anniversary of the Republic, and so on. And you can see also in this myth the kind of underlying previous myth of urban squares as places of public space and common life, and even start of democracy, that we have the urban square and agora as the beginning place of democracy, therefore bringing democracy to all those small towns also, or giving the power to the people. Yes, and it also, if you see behind the squares, the act of making them is has its own intention of celebrating, of teaching people to value this public space between buildings and so on. So it's even declared quite clearly. And as a myth, this primary speech, as Barth says, it's stolen speech. It's taken this kind of spatial language. It's taken the meaning of it, the functional meaningfulness is taken out, and it's deformed. In a way, you have all those spatial objects in there, the chairs, but then it is made into an artistic work that actually does something else. And it's in a way depolitization is used there, meaning in Barthesian sense that the relation to the everyday life and how do we manage and discuss in everyday life is taken away. It doesn't have really any connection to everyday life of people out there in those small towns. As you can see when you visit those places, they are quite empty. They're not used as everyday activity places, but rather as touristic places for local inhabitants also, that you go there to have a walk, to maybe show yourself, but considered to be foreign places, or not local, but imported. Yes, and in this way, you can say that these ideological models of space at the metaphysical level can be related to the myth of the idea of a lively public space that can be a tool of regional politics, which would then, in this metaphysical layer, involve, on one way, the modern design of public space that should bring life to small towns. This is the part of this underlying ideological idea. And the other hand, it's signifying this kind of people's power, or that people are in power here, which actually is also significant. You can see it also in the very use of the design of space. You have the squares with the kind of, so to say, functionality that people should come there, interact, and children play in playgrounds. It's kind of stage of public life of a small town with its small towniness. And on the very edge, or even a bit out of this square, which is also a kind of representative square, there is the local municipality. It's almost never on the very square itself. It's not like the square of municipality, but it's like observing from behind. in this sense, acting as if kind of local lively public space. But it's still a foreign space taken as or this spatial language is taken there to be used as this. And from the reception, you can see that it's not that well read, as it's not so well, the idea of architects is not really understood by the local people, and they discuss it mostly in relation to the actual everyday uses, while kind of specialists discuss it in the context of whether it's the valuable public space, how the public space should work, and this kind of more ideological ideas. So the interpretation also on different levels. And this kind of uses we can see on the picture here, where maybe you cannot see, depends on the quality, but that the use of those small town urban squares by actual local communities is quite rare. But here there is the signs of the use of it by some youngsters who have some drawings, some writing on the benches and walls. This is already the sign of taking this place to be their own. It's not that much dominantly related to this metaphysical layer and this myth of modernizing or so, but it's turning it into something else, a bit more lively and local space, but not really something that is foreseen in the architecture project itself. So for the reading of this kind of chronotopic analysis, it's always the question: what kind of focus do I take? Does the object give me the dominant reading mode and the point where I should start from? So that's the sketch of applying chronotopical analysis to the analysis of public space. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiit. And so we have some 5 minutes for questions. Are there questions here?
Do you have questions?
Please. Or do we have questions in Tartu or just in Zoom?
No, public space being poorly used.
Or from here.
Asking the basics of Barth. What's the difference between the mythologization of the space and the ideological notions of space?
So we have a question about what is the difference between mythologizing space and the,
Ideological portrayal.
like a proper ideological portrayal of space.
Well, I haven't gone so deep into the ideological. There is, but in general, I think, as I saw it now, is that ideological can be wider, either related to some kind of ideological paradigm, and this mythological aspect related more directly to a quite certain way of interpretation or a particular meaning that is inscribed there, as the idea of the analysis of myths should be kind of detection of an underlying myth, not so general overall structure. Maybe that's the difference.
Yeah.
We all recall, of course, that your dissertation from 2012, 15, geez, not that old. We all recall that your dissertation was on semiotics of space, or addressed this directly. Have you reformulated any of the basic premises of you said you've been working in the background on semiotics of space this whole time since then, and you've had time to reflect on the dissertation. Have you reprised any of the core tenets of the dissertation?
Oh, I haven't actually thought in this kind of way. More maybe developing, but not so directly comparing to it. But yeah, it would be interesting to revisit and see how would my ideas now relate to it.
Here's a ballpark question out of left field, I should say, regarding sociosemiotics, because we were designing the theme description for this series, Semiotics of Space. We know that social semiotics and sociosemiotics are interrelated with semiotics of space naturally because of concerns with urban studies and semiotics of the city. But we hesitated to use the term social or sociosemiotics in the abstract because we're not actually clear what's the difference between sociosemiotics and social semiotics. Can you say anything about that?
That's a provocative question.
Yes.
Well, depends from where do you look, but most generally social semiotics would be something that is nowadays developed into multimodal analysis.
Multimodal analysis.
Yeah, and the question of well, most of all, empirical study of signification of social meanings by semiotic resources would be the focus, I would say, which comes out of Kresslöven and others. And social semiotics has developed in Tartu has more attention into the semiotic fundaments in social theory. So going back to the, in a way, basics of semiotics and or the grounds of semiotics and social theory, and seeing where it comes together, and reaching to, well, also to social semiotic analysis of the use of semiotic resources, but also more widely, for example, to semiotics of space, and also closely relating also to the cultural semiotics, or the question of how social action and cultural languages and institutions are working in the social cultural world.
Excellent answer. Thank you very much.
Indeed, thank you.
You're welcome.
And yes, and so we now have to move on to our last speaker, but